Of 1,198 applicants, 985 women, including 27 women from minority communities, and 62 men. 756 have so far been awarded the legal status of victims of wartime sexual violence, affording them recognition and a small pension. Some of the 211 rejected applicants have appealed the decision in the courts. The law does not provide survivors with access to medical and psychological rehabilitation. International justice. No indictments were made public by the Kosovo Specialist Prosecutor's Office in The Hague, established to investigate alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity by the KLA, but around 100 former KLA members were summoned for questioning. Enforced disappearances. More than 20 years after the end of the war, 1,646 individuals remained missing. 264 of them female, including 1,100 Albanians, over 400 Serbs and 150 people of other ethnicities. In September, the remains of 7 Kosovo Serbs exhumed in Jakova/Jakovica in 2018 were returned to their relatives. Unlawful killings. In October, 2 suspects, 1 Kosovo Serb police officer suspected of concealing evidence, were arrested in Mitrovica in connection with the murder of Kosovo Serb leader Oliver Ivanovic in January 2018. 6 suspects were indicted in December. Deaths in custody. The investigation into the death in custody in 2016 of Vetëvendosje party member Astrid Dihari reopened in October after a Swiss forensic report undermined the authorities' suicide verdict. Freedom of expression. Media freedom and pluralism improved, with fewer physical attacks on journalists. However, in July, N1 TV's Kosovo correspondent Ana Simili received ethnically motivated death threats. A suspect was arrested in Serbia. In September and October, Serbian journalists were detained upon entering Kosovo. Violence against women and girls. Following repeated inadequate responses from the authorities, domestic violence was redefined in the 2019 Criminal Code as a separate criminal offence, and in accordance with the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, Istanbul Convention, which was also recognised in the Constitution. In September, Prizren Court awarded €95,000 compensation for their suffering to the parents of Diana Castrati, who was murdered by her former partner in 2011. This followed a 2013 Constitutional Court ruling that the authorities had violated Diana's rights in failing to respond to her request for an emergency protection order. In November, 6 men were charged in connection with the alleged rape of a 16-year-old schoolgirl in 2017. Among the 6 were her former teacher and the police officer assigned to investigate the case. Discrimination, Roma. Members of the Roma, Ashkali and Egyptians, Ray, communities experienced chronic discrimination in education, health, housing and employment, and many lacked personal documentation. In March, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Toxics urged the UN to immediately award compensation to members of Ray communities exposed to lead poisoning while displaced in UN-run camps from 1999 to 2013, a recommendation made in 2016 by the Human Rights Advisory Panel. Rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex people. In August, an appeals court ruling enabled transgender people to register changes of name and gender. In October, Pristina Pride urged the government and courts to respect and implement laws on sexual minorities. Human rights in Europe. 68. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. Protest against repressive legislation restricting access to safe abortion care in Bratislava, Slovakia. Copyright Dorota Holubova. Slovakia. Slovak Republic Head of State, Zuzana Kaputova, replaced Andrej Kiska in June. Head of Government, Peter Pellegrini. Background. In March, voters elected Slovakia's first female president on an anti-corruption platform. In March, a businessman was charged with ordering the murder of investigative journalist Jan Kuciak and his fiancée in 2018. In April, a former soldier was charged with carrying out the killings. The journalist had been investigating various allegations of irregularities in public procurement, some of which involved the businessman charged with ordering his murder. Several months before his death, Jan Kuciak had filed a criminal complaint against the same man, alleging he had made direct threats against him. Discrimination, Roma. In August, the Constitutional Court awarded compensation to a group of Roma, represented by the Centre for Civil and Human Rights (NGO), for the delays they had experienced in a 13-year search for justice against discrimination. They had first turned to the courts in 2006 after staff at a village pub in eastern Slovakia refused to serve them because of their ethnic origin. Police and security forces. Allegations of excessive use of force by the police against Roma persisted, alongside a lack of independent scrutiny. In June, the Public Defender of Human Rights criticised the failure of the Police Inspectorate to investigate allegations that police had used excessive force during an operation in the Roma settlement of Moldovan Nadbodovo in June 2013. Resulting in injuries to over 30 individuals, including children. In the absence of a domestic remedy, 8 of the Roma brought a case before the European Court of Human Rights, which was ongoing at the end of the year. The public defender also raised concerns about police investigations into 6 of the victims for allegedly falsely accusing the police of wrongdoing. Right to education. In January, the government updated action plans for the 2020 Roma Inclusion Strategy, one of the objectives of which is to address the racial school segregation of Roma. Despite these, human rights in Europe. 69. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. Commitments. Concerns over racial discrimination against Roma children in education persisted. A report commissioned by the Ministry of Finance identified systemic shortcomings and continuing discrimination of Roma in access to education, as well as employment and healthcare. It raised concerns that Roma children were often educated in separate classes in mainstream schools, and that over half of the pupils in special schools for children with mental disabilities were Roma and/or recipients of welfare. Similar concerns were expressed during the year by other bodies, including the European Commission, which escalated the infringement proceedings against Slovakia for breaching the EU's equality legislation in October. The Commission gave the government 2 months to take measures to address the systematic discrimination and segregation of Roma children in education, otherwise, it could decide to refer the matter to the Court of Justice of the EU. In November, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, CESC, called on the government to take immediate steps to increase the integration of Roma children who are currently in special schools and classes into mainstream education. Forced sterilizations. In June, the Centre for Civil and Human Rights raised concerns over the ongoing failure of the government to take responsibility for forced sterilizations of Roma women and ensure the survivors have access to remedy. A 2018 proposal by the Public Defender of Human Rights to adopt special legislation providing a framework for adequate compensation to the victims of these violations had not been actioned by the end of the year. In November, The CESC called on Slovakia to ensure full, independent and transparent investigation of cases of forced sterilization of Roma women and to provide remedies to all victims thereof. Women's rights. In March, the Parliament refused to ratify the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, Istanbul Convention. NGOs working with survivors of domestic violence raised concerns at the authorities' continued failure to adequately address domestic violence and provide sufficient funding for support services. Attempts in Parliament to further restrict access to and to criminalise abortion continued. In September and October, the Parliament rejected 4 such proposals, including one from the far-right People's Party, Our Slovakia, which would have shortened the permitted limit until which an abortion could be performed from 12 to 8 weeks. In December, amidst protests of rights organisations, the MPs rejected another draft legislation that would have forced women seeking an abortion to view an ultrasound scan of the embryo or fetus. The Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe called on the Parliament to reject the law, which would jeopardize human rights. Refugees and asylum seekers. In August, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, CRC, intervened against a separation of an Afghan asylum-seeking family and prevented the authorities from transferring the mother and 4 children to the Netherlands, under the Dublin III regulation. An NGO, Human Rights League, campaigned on the case. Torture and other ill treatment. In July, a year after the Slovak authorities extradited Aslan Yandov to the Russian Federation, he was sentenced to 19 years imprisonment. 2 of the 3 witnesses withdrew their statements on grounds that they had been extracted under torture. Amnesty International had been among those denouncing his extradition, as there was evidence that he would face real risks of torture and other ill treatment if returned, in violation of Slovakia's obligations under international law. Human Rights in Europe. 70. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. Roma child in Ribnica settlement in Slovenia. Copyright Jaka Gaz R. Slovenia. Republic of Slovenia Head of State, Borut Pahor Head of Government, Margins Air. Slovenia failed to respect, protect and promote the rights of refugees and migrants. The legal definition of rape in the criminal code fell short of international human rights law and standards. The social care system for the elderly remained grossly inadequate. Roma continued to face widespread discrimination and social exclusion in all walks of life. Refugees and asylum seekers. Many potential asylum seekers irregularly entering Slovenia were denied access to asylum, fined and forcibly returned, frequently in groups, to neighbouring Croatia. Such collective expulsions took place without appropriate procedural safeguards against refoulement, that is, forced return to a country or territory where persecution is likely, and despite credible reports of widespread violence and abuse by the Croatian police and the risk of their likely further expulsion to Bosnia and Herzegovina. 1. Human rights organizations documented numerous cases of the Slovenian authorities ignoring asylum seekers' intention to apply for international protection and failing to provide information or adequate translation assistance to those arriving at the border. The authorities failed to properly and effectively investigate these allegations. The government also continued to deny public access to official information relating to police procedures and the general situation at the Slovenian-Croatian border, despite the Information Commissioner's instruction that these documents be made public. The government contested the request for disclosure in the courts. Violence against women and girls. The definition of rape in the criminal code remained based on the use of force, threat of force or coercion, rather than lack of consent, contrary to international human rights law and standards. The Ministry of Justice committed to address this as part of wider changes to the Criminal Code and established a working group to propose reforms. There was no formal proposal by the end of the year. Economic, social and cultural rights. In September, the Court of Audit issued a report on the social care system which Human Rights in Europe. 71. Review of 2019. Amnesty International criticised the government's complacency over the past decade and concluded that the system was in a critical condition. According to the report, the authorities failed to provide adequate access to long-term affordable residential care for the majority of people who needed it. Elderly people from lower socio-economic backgrounds were disproportionately affected. Nursing home representatives reported that approximately 53,000 applications were filed for estimated 20,000 beds, reflecting growing concern about inadequate capacity for the aging population in publicly funded facilities. In September, the Ministry of Health announced the preparation of long-delayed draft legislation on long-term care for the elderly, but no progress was made before the end of the year. Discrimination, Roma. Roma continued to face widespread discrimination, higher levels of unemployment and social exclusion. Many still lived in segregated settlements and inadequate housing, lacking security of tenure and access to water, electricity, sanitation and public transport. The Ministry for the Environment prepared draft amendments to the Building Act, implementing an October 2017 Constitutional Court ruling that demolishing an illegally constructed building which was a person's only home constituted a violation of the right to housing. The draft legislation, if adopted, would provide more substantial safeguards against forced evictions, in particular in unregulated Roma settlements. Roma pupils' educational achievement rates remained poor, with unofficially collected data showing that over 60% failed to complete primary education. A more comprehensive assessment of Roma students' performance and completion rates in primary schools was not available, however, as the government continued the practice of not systematically collecting data on Roma children. Roma children continued to be disproportionately represented in special needs schools. 1. Amnesty International pushed to the edge violence and abuse against refugees and migrants along Balkan route. Index Euro 5/9964/2019 www.amnesty.org/documents/Euro 5/9964/2019/Shen/ Human Rights in Europe. 72. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. International Women's Day demonstration in Madrid, March 8, 2019. The banner reads, "Transform the World." Copyright Adolfo Lujan. Spain. Kingdom of Spain Head of State, King Felipe VI de Bourbon. Head of Government, Pedro Sanchez. Jordi Sanchez and Jordi Cuixart, presidents of two pro-independence organizations in Catalonia, were among those sentenced for their role in the protests held in Barcelona on the 20th of September 2017 and for their involvement in the 1st of October 2017 referendum on Catalan independence. The outcome of investigations into excessive use of force by police during the 2017 demonstrations remain pending. The Supreme Court upheld the convictions of 8 people for their involvement in a 2016 attack on 2 off-duty police officers and their partners in Alsasua, Navarra, but rejected the aggravating factors for terrorist offences and reduced their sentences. Amid ongoing economic challenges, obstacles to access to housing and health care persisted. Despite recent reforms, Migrants in an irregular situation continued to face obstacles in accessing healthcare. Hundreds of people continued to face forced eviction without access to alternative housing. Trial of Catalan leaders. Between February and June, 12 Catalan leaders stood trial in connection with events in September and October 2017 surrounding a referendum on independence conducted by the Catalan regional government in defiance of several constitutional court rulings. In October, the Supreme Court found 7 senior Catalan officials, 6 former members of the Catalan government and the former president of the Catalan parliament, and the presidents of 2 pro-independence organizations, Jordi Sanchez and Jordi Cuixart, guilty of sedition. They were sentenced to prison terms of between 9 and 13 years. 3 other former members of the Catalan government were convicted of disobedience, fined and disqualified from public office. While there was no evidence that the right to a fair trial of the 12 Catalan leaders had been violated, there are concerns that the crime of sedition, of which 9 of them were convicted, is both vaguely defined in law and was broadly interpreted by the court in a way that disproportionately restricts the exercise of human rights. In addition, the convictions for the crime of sedition of Jordi Sanchez and Jordi Cuixart, who had been held on remand since the 16th of October 2017, constituted an excessive and disproportionate restriction. Human rights in Europe. 73. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. Of the right to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. Amnesty International therefore called for their convictions to be quashed and for their immediate release. Excessive use of force. Following the Supreme Court ruling in October, several protests took place in Catalonia. Although most demonstrations were largely peaceful, there were several violent incidents during which hundreds of people were injured. This included 318 members of the security forces, one of whom was injured seriously. In a number of instances, the police used excessive force against protesters. At least 367 people needed medical assistance, 4 of whom reportedly lost sight in one eye after being hit by rubber bullets and balls fired by police to disperse protesters. None of the investigations into reports of excessive use of force by police during the protests in October 2017 in Catalonia had resulted in prosecutions by the end of the year. Freedom of expression and assembly. The authorities continued to use the law on public security to impose administrative sanctions, including increasingly heavy fines, on protesters, human rights defenders and journalists. In some cases, this unlawfully restricted their rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and access to information. In April, journalist Michael Santaburuaga, who had been fined €602 in July 2017 for crossing police lines and endangering officers' safety in Vitoria, Basque Country, was acquitted. The court found that the authorities failed to sufficiently demonstrate that his aim was to disobey police orders rather than pursue his journalistic activities. At least 3 people were tried for expressing opinions that the authorities considered constituted incitement to terrorism, despite failing to demonstrate that the threshold of prohibited speech under international human rights law was reached. They were charged under counter-terrorism legislation that outlaws the glorification of terrorism and humiliation of victims. 1 was acquitted, and 2 were convicted over comments posted on social media, which were regarded as a glorification of the armed organization Esquadrilla Escartusina, ETA. At least 2 prosecutions were initiated for offences related to publicly disparaging dogmas, beliefs, rites or public ceremonies, causing offence to members of religious groups or slander or defamation against the Crown. In October, After a 5-year trial, 3 women's rights activists prosecuted for causing offense to religious feelings after participating in a feminist demonstration in Seville in May 2014 were acquitted. During the demonstration, they had carried a model of a vagina, used religious ornaments and used the format of prayer to express their opinions. Torture and other ill treatment. Legislation to provide adequate reparations to victims of torture and other ill treatment faced continuing obstacles. In April, the Basque Parliament passed a second law on recognition and reparation for victims of political violence. However, in September, the Constitutional Court declared admissible 2 appeals against this law lodged by the political parties Ciudadanos and the Partido Popular. A similar law passed in Navarra in March also remained subject to a constitutional challenge since September. A previous similar law of 2015 was declared unconstitutional. In May, the UN Human Rights Committee found that Spain had violated the human rights of Gorka Lupianes Mintegi, a member of the armed organization ETA, by failing to carry out a thorough investigation into his allegations of torture. Gorka Lupianes Mintegi was arrested in December 2007 and, at his first hearing before the National High Court on the 11th of December 2007, had alleged that he had been tortured while held incommunicado. However, no investigation into his allegation was initiated until 2008, after he filed a complaint before an investigative judge. The case was subsequently closed for lack of evidence. The committee urged Spain to end incommunicado detention as it can facilitate torture and other ill treatment. Refugees and migrants. Between January and December, 118,264 people claimed asylum, 53,723 of them women. There was continuing concern about the increasing backlog of pending asylum decisions. Between January and December, the number of people awaiting decisions on their applications rose from 85,185 to 133,015. Delays in receiving decisions had a negative impact on asylum seekers' right to adequate reception conditions. Spain failed to fulfill its 2015 pledge to relocate 15,888 asylum seekers from Greece and Italy under the European Union Emergency Relocating Scheme, as only 1,359 were relocated by April 2018 when the scheme ended. Since 2016, Spain had resettled only 2,040 of the 3,464 refugees it promised to resettle under a separate procedure from countries outside the European Union. Hundreds of people were expelled to Morocco under the 1992 readmission agreement, under accelerated proceedings which in certain circumstances may have failed to ensure access to asylum. A Grand Chamber ruling of the European Court of Human Rights remained pending on Spain's appeal against a 2017 first ruling of the same court that the immediate return to Morocco of migrants attempting to enter Spanish territory in Melilla in 2014 amounted to a collective expulsion, case ND and N.TV Spain. Investigations into racially motivated attacks on unaccompanied children in Catalonia between February and March were continuing at the end of the year. In November, bomb disposal experts. Human rights in Europe. 74. Review of 2019. Amnesty International detonated a hand grenade that had failed to explode after it was left in the patio of a youth shelter for unaccompanied children in Madrid by unknown assailants. This was later found to be a grenade used for training purposes. Counter-terrorism and security. In October, the Supreme Court upheld the conviction of 8 people for their involvement in an attack on 2 off-duty Civil Guard officials and their partners in Alsasua, Nivra, in 2016. However, the Supreme Court rejected the imposition of heavier penalties for aggravating circumstances by the National High Court, Audiencia Nacional, on the grounds that the attack was motivated by ideological discrimination and reduced their sentences. The Supreme Court found that, in terms of a discrimination constituting an aggravating circumstance, the Civil Guard could not be regarded as a vulnerable group facing discrimination. Violence against women. 55 women and 3 children were killed by their partners or former partners. In June, the Supreme Court convicted 5 men of rape in the so-called Wolfpack case. The ruling overturned previous judgments by the Nivra courts, which had found the men not guilty of rape due to a lack of evidence of violence or intimidation of the victim, and had instead convicted them from the lesser offence of sexual abuse. Widespread protests in 2018 in reaction to the Nivra court's judgments had led the government to announce that laws would be amended in 2020 to make clear that sex without consent is rape. According to official data, 11,587 complaints of sexual violence were filed with the police between January and September 2019. Victims of sexual violence faced obstacles when seeking justice and a lack of adequate protection, assistance and support measures. Right to housing. Between January and September, there were 40,492 evictions of people who were unable to pay their mortgages, 10,673, rent, 26,962, or for other reasons, 2,857. In March, the government adopted Royal Decree Law 7/2019 improving protection for tenants, but this contained insufficient measures to strengthen protection from forced evictions or ensure access to affordable housing. In October 2019, the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, CESCR, found that Spain violated a family's right to housing by failing to take into account their vulnerability in an eviction and without a court considering the proportionality of the measure. More than 100 cases regarding housing rights remained pending before the CESCR. Right to health. Austerity measures adopted in 2012 affecting access to health care were not reversed during 2019. Many of these changes continued to have a disproportionate impact on people on lower incomes, especially those with chronic health conditions or disabilities, older people and those seeking mental health care. The UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities asked Spain to ensure the accessibility and availability of healthcare services for all persons with disabilities. In June, a Supreme Court ruling prevented access to health care to a Cuban woman who had legally been reunited with her daughter in Spain on the grounds that a temporary residence permit for a family member of European Union citizens does not imply the automatic existence of this right. The decision contravened UN and Council of Europe recommendations to Spain to ensure equal access to health care without discrimination. Migrants in an irregular situation continued to face obstacles in accessing health care such as administrative barriers due to the ambiguity of the July 2018 Royal Decree Law 7/2018 on universal access to the national health system. Impunity. In October, the remains of former ruler Francisco Franco were exhumed from the Val de los Caídos cemetery and taken to a private family vault in Madrid, as recommended by UN human rights bodies. Victims of human rights violations committed under his regime continued to be denied their right to truth, justice and reparation. No investigations were initiated into crimes under international law committed during the Civil War, 1936 to 1939, and the Franco regime, such as enforced disappearances and torture. Efforts to locate and identify the remains of victims were still mainly undertaken by families and organizations, without state support. Individuals affected by the so-called stolen babies cases continued to face obstacles and difficulties in finding out the truth about their identity and the whereabouts of their relatives. Human rights in Europe. 75. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. Members of Amnesty International Sweden take part in demonstration against sexual violence in Stockholm on 8th of March 2019. Copyright AI Sweden. Sweden. Kingdom of Sweden. Head of State, King Carl XVI. Gustaf. Head of Government, Stefan Löfven. Rape and other forms of sexual violence against women and girls remained widespread. Roma people continued to face discrimination. Torture was not criminalized in Swedish criminal law. Women's rights. Sexual violence, particularly against women and girls, remained pervasive, and 6,256 rapes against people aged 15 or above were reported in 2019, according to official preliminary crime statistics. Parliament had passed a law in 2018 which changed the legal definition of rape to a consent-based one. However, Amnesty International noted in April that survivors continued to face barriers in accessing justice, and few investigations led to prosecutions and convictions. Many of the flaws stemmed from the police's inadequate handling of rape cases, including inconsistent implementation of investigative best practice, significant delays both in interrogation of suspects and in obtaining results of forensic analysis. 1. In June, the police authority announced an initiative to intensify efforts to improve the quality and efficiency of rape investigations, which included the recruitment of 350 new investigators. Discrimination. So-called vulnerable EU citizens, primarily citizens of Romania and Bulgaria, the majority of whom are Roma, who live in destitution and homelessness in Sweden, continued to face discriminatory treatment, with many sleeping in tents or temporary settlements on the outskirts of cities. Forced evictions occurred. Many vulnerable EU citizens had taken recourse to begging on the streets, which 11 municipalities made a criminal offence, following an administrative High Court decision in December 2018 enabling municipalities to pass local begging bans. Anti-begging rhetoric from leading politicians and opinion makers across the political spectrum fed deep discriminatory attitudes and increased the risk of human rights violations against Roma EU citizens already living in destitution in Sweden. In Stockholm, harassment and removal by the police of Roma EU citizens who beg continued. Local support groups reported an increasing number of hate crimes targeting Roma EU citizens in municipalities where bans had been introduced. Human rights in Europe. 76. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. Corporate accountability. SAB, which has supplied military equipment to the Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates-led coalition that is a party to the ongoing conflict in Yemen, was one of the several global defense sector companies identified by Amnesty International as failing to adequately meet their responsibility under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights to identify and address the human rights risks of their operations. 2. Refugees and asylum seekers. Sweden continued to forcibly return asylum seekers to Afghanistan despite the worsening security situation in the country. This was in line with the Swedish Migration Agency's new legal comment adopted in February, using the practice of internal flight alternatives for relocation in Afghanistan. Amnesty International called for a halt to this practice. the government gave its approval for the public prosecutor to file formal charges against 2 top-level representatives of the Swedish oil company Lundin Petroleum for their alleged complicity in serious violations of international law in what is now South Sudan. The charges had yet to be filed at the end of the year. Torture and other ill treatment. Torture had still not been criminalized in the Penal Code, despite long-standing criticism by the UN Committee Against Torture and other human rights mechanisms. Indigenous peoples' rights. In August, the government declared that it would work towards establishing a Sami Truth Commission together with the Sami Parliament. However, during a Supreme Court hearing in a case on Sami fishing and hunting rights in October, the Government Council stated that Sweden had no obligations to recognize the indigenous Sami people's rights, in sharp contrast to Sweden's position on indigenous people's rights elsewhere. The court decision is expected in January 2020. 1. Amnesty International, Europe. Time for change. Justice for rape survivors in the Nordic countries. Index ERO1/0089/2019. www.amnesty.org. Web link ERO1/0089/2019/shen/. 2. Amnesty International. Outsourcing responsibility. Human rights policies in the defense sector. Index Act 30/0893/2019. www.amnesty.org. Web link Act 30/0893/2019/shen/. Human rights in Europe. 77. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. Photo action with AI Switzerland activists and staff in front of the Bundeshaus in Bern, Switzerland, the 21st of May 2019. Copyright AI Switzerland. Switzerland. Swiss Confederation Head of State and Government, Ali Moura. A new accelerated asylum procedure came into force. A study giving detailed figures on the extent of sexual violence against women was published, initiating a broad discussion on women's rights and sexual violence. Refugees and asylum seekers. A new asylum law came into force on the 1st of March. Asylum procedures were accelerated in the federal centres of the 6 asylum regions. The government set a goal to complete 60% of asylum applications within 140 days of arrival. Asylum seekers are also to receive pre-counselling and legal representation in the new procedures. However, no reliable system had been put in place to proactively identify vulnerable asylum seekers and their needs related to procedures and accommodation. Direct access to specialist medical care is difficult for asylum seekers, and people seeking to assist asylum seekers face restrictions in accessing federal centres. The number of asylum applications had reached its lowest level since 2007, with 14,269 applications lodged in 2019. The Swiss asylum authorities continue to rely on a rigid application of the Dublin Agreement, regularly returning even vulnerable asylum seekers and people who have relatives in Switzerland to their first country of entry. The accommodation of rejected asylum seekers who cannot be returned to their countries of origin amounted to inhuman treatment. Under the government's emergency assistance regime, these people are housed in underground civil defence facilities in some cantons, Zurich and Ticino. In 2015, the National Commission for the Prevention of Torture, NCPT, considered this to be permissible for a maximum period of 3 months. Human rights defenders. In at least 5 cantons, immediate criminal orders were issued against people who helped others to settle in Switzerland and access protection and livelihood means in Switzerland. When they opposed the conviction, they faced trial. Among them were human rights defenders Annie Lance, Pastor Norbert Valley and Lisa Bosia Mira. Under federal Swiss law, non-aggravated cases of facilitating entry, stay in circulation, that is, not for payment, is punishable with a fine and Human Rights in Europe. 78. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. In some cases criminal registration. National Councillor Lisa Mazzone introduced a parliamentary initiative to explicitly exempt from punishment this kind of action to aid people in the future. In spring 2020, the Parliament will debate the use of this provision and the introduction of a humanitarian exemption. Women's rights. The women's strike on the 14th of June was one of the largest mobilizations in Switzerland's history. About 500,000 people took to the streets calling for an end to continuing discrimination against women. Amnesty International commissioned research on the prevalence of sexual harassment and sexual violence in Switzerland. The organization called for reform of Swiss criminal law, so that rape is defined on the basis of lack of consent in line with international human rights standards. Currently, the legal definition of rape in Switzerland continues to be based on violence, threats of violence or other means of coercion. Counter-terror and security. After two new laws had already been introduced in 2017 and 2018, two new anti-terrorist laws were discussed in Parliament in autumn 2019. They are expected to be passed in 2020. The amendment of anti-terror legislation for the first time introduced a definition of terrorism. Vague and overly broad offences can result in encroachments on fundamental rights and arbitrary application. In May, the Federal Council presented the Federal Act on Police Measures to Combat Terrorism, which Amnesty had criticised as too far-reaching. The law provides for a series of preventive coercive measures against so-called persons likely to threaten public safety. This provision lacks clarity and violates the principle of legality. Rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex people, LGBT. In December 2018, the Swiss Parliament decided to expand the scope of the law on penalizing racism to include calls for hatred and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Opponents have called for a national referendum, which may take place in February 2020. Discrimination based on gender identity, however, remained outside the scope of the legislation. Legal, constitutional or institutional developments. In December, the Federal Council has adopted a draft law on the creation of a National Human Rights Institution, NHRI. The draft complies with the Paris Principles relating to the national institutions from the promotion and protection of human rights. However, the budget attributed to the future NHRI is low, 1 million CHF/year. The Parliament is expected to discuss the draft law and should adopt a final version before the end of 2020. Human Rights in Europe. 79. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. Police preventing members of Parliament from the opposition People's Democratic Party and others from reading out a statement criticising Operation Peace Spring, Debate. The 20th of October 2019. Copyright by Al-Guldam, Mesopotamia Agency. Turkey. Republic of Turkey Head of State and Government, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The crackdown on real or perceived dissent continued in 2019, despite the end of the 2-year-long state of emergency in July 2018. Thousands of people were held in lengthy and punitive pre-trial detention, often without any credible evidence of their having committed any crime recognizable under international law. There were severe restrictions on the rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, and people considered critical of the current government, in particular journalists, political activists and human rights defenders, were detained or faced trumped-up criminal charges. The authorities continued to arbitrarily ban demonstrations and use unnecessary and excessive force to disperse peaceful protesters. There were credible reports of torture and enforced disappearances. Turkey forcibly returned Syrian refugees, while continuing to host more refugees than any other country. Background. Between January and May, thousands of prisoners joined parliamentarian Leyla Güven hunger strikes to demand that armed Kurdistan Workers' Party leader Abdullah Öcalan be allowed to receive visits from his family and lawyers. The hunger strikers and those who took solidarity actions in their support were criminalized, and many were prosecuted under anti-terrorism laws. The result of the March municipal elections in Istanbul was annulled on spurious grounds by the Supreme Election Board following the victory of the main opposition Republican People's Party (CHP) candidate. In June, he won the rerun of the election with an increased majority. Elected mayors in 32 municipalities representing the leftist, Kurdish-rooted People's Democracy Party (HDP) were removed from office on spurious grounds and replaced with elected civil servants. The government cited ongoing terrorism-related investigations and prosecutions for their removal. At the end of the year, 18 remained in pre-trial detention. On the 9th of October, Turkey launched a military offensive against Kurdish forces in northeast Syria, Operation Peace Spring, with the stated aim of establishing a 32 kilometers deep border safe zone. The operation, conducted by the Turkish military together with allied Syrian armed groups, effectively ended on the 22nd of October, amid evidence of war crimes. In the last quarter of the year, a Human Rights in Europe 80 Review of 2019 Amnesty International Judicial reform package was passed by Parliament. The reforms failed to address the structural flaws in a judiciary under extreme political pressure or to end unfair and politically motivated prosecutions and convictions. 1. Freedom of expression. Criminal investigations and prosecutions under anti-terrorism laws and punitive pre-trial detention continued to be used, in the absence of evidence of any criminal wrongdoing, to silence real or perceived dissent. The courts locked online content, and criminal investigations were launched against hundreds of social media users. In August, a new regulation came into effect that requires Internet broadcasting platforms to apply for licenses to the Radio and Television Supreme Council, TUC. The content of the platforms will be monitored by the TUC, expanding its censorship powers over online content. At least 839 social media accounts were investigated for allegedly sharing criminal content related to Operation Peace Spring. Hundreds of people were taken into police custody, and at least 24 were remanded in pre-trial detention. 2. Journalists. Dozens of journalists and other media workers remained in prison, either in pre-trial detention or serving a custodial sentence. Some of those investigated and prosecuted under anti-terrorism laws were convicted and sentenced to years of imprisonment. Their peaceful journalistic work presented as evidence of a criminal offence. On the 5th of July, the Supreme Court of Appeals overturned the first instance court's conviction of journalists Samet Altan and Nazlil Kak for attempting to overthrow the constitutional order. In November, they were convicted of knowingly and willingly assisting a terrorist organization without being a member, following a retrial, and sentenced to prison terms of 10 years and 6 months and 8 years and 9 months respectively. Both were released on the 4th of November pending appeal. However, Ahmet Altan was rearrested on the 12th of November following a prosecution appeal against his release. He remained in Silivri prison at the end of the year. Journalists have also faced intimidation when covering protests. Zeynep Karay and Rafan Tanslik were taken into police custody on the 10th of May 2019 while covering protests in Istanbul held in solidarity with prison hunger strikers. They were released on bail on the 13th of May pending criminal investigation. Hukundima, the digital services manager of Bergen Daily newspaper, and Fatih Okundayla, the managing editor of the news website Deccan, were detained on the 10th of October in relation to news articles about Operation Peace Spring, which did not contain language inciting violence or any other content that may be considered criminal. Both were released later the same day and banned from travelling overseas pending criminal investigations. On the 27th of October, lawyer and columnist Nukan Kaya was detained at Istanbul airport in connection with an investigation launched against her for inciting enmity or hatred for a tweet criticising Operation Peace Spring. She was released the same day but subsequently banned from travelling abroad pending the outcome of the investigation. Human rights defenders. Dozens of human rights defenders faced criminal investigations and prosecutions and were held in police custody or imprisoned for their human rights work. The trial of the 11 human rights defenders in the Bu Ayukada case, including the former chair, ex-director and several members of Amnesty Turkey as well as women's and equality advocates, continued in 2019 on baseless charges of membership of a terrorist organization. If convicted, they could face up to 15 years imprisonment. Civil society leader Osman Kavala and 15 other civil society figures faced charges of attempting to overthrow the government or prevent it from performing its duties for their alleged role in directing the Gezi Park protests of 2013. If convicted, they could face life imprisonment without parole. On the 10th of December, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that Osman Kavala's extended pre-trial detention lacked reasonable suspicion and was carried out with the ulterior purpose of reducing him to silence, calling for his immediate release. By the end of the year, he had been held in Silivri High Security Prison for over 2 years. His co-defendant Yigit Iksakoglu was released on bail at his first trial hearing in June after 7 months in prison. Human rights lawyer Eren Keskin remained at risk of imprisonment as a result of over 140 separate prosecutions for her past role as symbolic editor-in-chief of the now-closed Kurdish daily newspaper Özgür Gündem. In October, her home was raided and she was questioned by the Istanbul Security Directorate Anti-Terrorism Branch for sharing posts on the social media criticizing Operation Peace Spring. Politicians and activists. In July, a constitutional court overturned the convictions of 10 academics of making propaganda for a terrorist organization for signing a peace petition in 2016 criticizing indefinite curfews and security operations in southeastern Turkey. Hundreds more on trial for their support of the petition were acquitted following this decision, while others continued to face charges despite the Constitutional Court ruling that the charges violated the right to freedom of expression. In September, food engineer and dismissed academic Dr. Bülent Eskay was convicted of disclosing classified information and sentenced to 15 months imprisonment for a series of articles exposing the presence of carcinogenic pesticides and other toxins in agricultural products and water. His appeal against the conviction was pending at the end of the year. Human rights in Europe. 81. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. 2 former co-chairs of the People's Democratic Party, HDP, Selahattin Demirtas and Figen Yüksekdag, remained imprisoned, convicted of terrorism-related charges which, in the absence of credible evidence, were largely based on their public speeches. 20 HDP-affiliated elected mayors of municipalities where trustees were appointed by the state were remanded in pre-trial detention since municipal elections in March. 18 remained in pre-trial detention at the end of the year. In September, Istanbul provincial chairperson of the main opposition Republican People's Party, CHP, Canan Kaftankoglu, was sentenced to 9 years and 8 months in prison for insulting the president, insulting a public official because of her duty, provoking people into enmity and hatred, and propaganda for a terrorist organization. Freedom of assembly. Blanket bans on all assemblies were issued in various cities across the country without any individual assessment of the need and proportionality of such measures. Police violently broke up a number of peaceful protests, and scores of peaceful protesters faced criminal investigations and prosecutions on charges including propaganda for a terrorist organization, participation in an unlawful assembly, and resisting police. Several provincial governors continued to use extraordinary powers contained in a law introduced after the end of the state of emergency to restrict the right to peaceful assembly. A blanket and indefinite ban on all lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex LGBT events imposed by the Ankara Governorate in November 2017 was finally lifted in April 2019 following a court order, after which LGBT events were banned individually. The Student Pride March at the Middle East Technical University, METU, in Ankara in May was banned by the university management and broken up by police using unnecessary and excessive force. Blanket bans were issued by Izmir, Antalya and Mersin governorates in June 2019 to prevent Pride Week events taking place. The Istanbul Pride March was banned for the 5th year in a row. In March, authorities banned the International Women's Day March in Istanbul just before it took place. Police used tear gas and other excessive force to disperse thousands of peaceful participants. In November, police in Istanbul attacked hundreds of women protesters who had gathered for the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women with tear gas and plastic bullets, and a criminal investigation was opened against 25 participants of a Last Tesis protest in Izmir. In December, police dispersed the Last Tesis protest in Istanbul with excessive use of force and detained 6 participants who were released the following day. Police in Antalya prevented around 100 women from holding a Last Tesis protest. Blanket bans were imposed on assemblies expressing solidarity with those on hunger strike between November 2018 and May 20,193, as well as those protesting against the removal of elected mayors from office and against Operation Peace Spring. The peaceful gatherings of the Saturday Mothers, a group that since the mid-1990s has held weekly vigils in Galatasaray Square for victims of enforced disappearances, remained subject to the ban imposed in August 2018 when they were removed with unnecessary and excessive use of force. A blanket ban remains imposed on all protests in the square. University students continued to be prosecuted for participating in peaceful protests. These included 30 students from Bogazici University peacefully protesting against Turkey's military involvement in Afrin in Syria, and 4 students from the Middle East Technical University, METU, displaying a banner depicting a caricature of President Erdogan during the university's graduation ceremony. Both prosecutions began in 2018 and were continuing at the end of the year. 18 students and a member of academic staff from METU faced prosecution under the law on meetings and demonstrations for their alleged participation in the banned Pride March in May. Right to work and freedom of movement. More than 115,000 of the 129,411 public sector workers, including academics, soldiers, police officers, teachers and doctors, arbitrarily dismissed by emergency decree following the 2016 coup attempt remained barred from working in the public sector and were denied passports. Many workers and their families have experienced destitution as well as tremendous social stigma, having been listed in the executive decrees as having links to terrorist organizations. A commission of inquiry set up to review their appeals before they could seek judicial review assessed 98,300 of the 126,300 applications it received and rejected 88,700 of them. A law adopted in 2018, Law number 7145, that allows dismissal from public service to be extended for a further 3 years on the same vague grounds of alleged links to terrorist organizations, was used by the Council of Judges and Prosecutors to dismiss at least 16 judges and 7 prosecutors during the year, further undermining the independence and integrity of the judicial system. Several cases of a dismissal from public service remained pending before the European Court of Human Rights at the end of the year. These include the cases of Hamid Piskine, a civil servant dismissed from his post, and 3 dismissed academics, Alfan Telek, Edgar Sarens, Inep KVLCM, who had had their passports cancelled and been banned from public service following their signing a petition criticising security operations in southeastern Turkey. Human Rights in Europe. 82. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. Torture and other ill treatment. Credible allegations of torture and other ill treatment continued to be reported. In Urfa, Eastern Turkey, men and women who were detained in May after an armed clash between security forces and the Armed Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, reported, through their lawyers, that they had been tortured, including with electric shocks to genitals. Lawyers reported that some of the former Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials detained in Ankara Security Directorate in May accused of membership of a terrorist organization, aggravated fraud and forgery for terrorism purposes, were stripped naked and threatened with being raped with batons. In both cases, lawyers reported that their clients did not have access to a confidential consultation with a doctor. Enforced disappearances. 6 men, accused of links with the Fethullah Gulen movement who went missing in February, suspected of having been the victims of enforced disappearance, resurfaced in police detention 5 to 9 months after their disappearance. The authorities did not provide any information to the public or the families of the men about the circumstances surrounding their disappearance or how 5 came to find themselves in the anti-terrorism branch of the Ankara police headquarters and 1 in the Antalya police headquarters. Months after their disappearance, the 6 men were reported by their families to have lost weight, be very pale and nervous. The men reportedly did not disclose what had happened to them during the months they were disappeared. Following up to 12 days in police custody, they were all remanded in pre-trial detention on terrorism charges following court hearings without the knowledge of their lawyers or families. The fate and whereabouts of a 7th man, Yusuf Bilgtans, who disappeared in August under similar suspicious circumstances, remained unknown at the end of the year. Refugees and asylum seekers. Turkey continued to host more refugees and asylum seekers than any other country, with over 3.6 million refugees from Syria and about 400,000 refugees and asylum seekers from other countries. In 2019, however, Syrian refugees faced increased difficulties in the context of deepening political polarization and a worsening economic outlook in the country, contributing to growing public criticism and intolerance towards the Syrian population. The 2016 European Union Turkey Statement, which contributes funds towards Turkey's hosting of refugees in exchange for, among other things, Turkey's cooperation in preventing refugees and asylum seekers from fleeing onwards to the European Union remained operational. As of the 30th of September, about €2.57 billion of the total €6 billion promised had been disbursed. Between July and October, at least 20 Syrians were forcibly and unlawfully returned to northwestern Syria, where they faced real risk of serious human rights violations. For no official figures were available to estimate the number of people forcibly deported, but based on the statements received by Amnesty International, returns during this period affected dozens of people each time, suggesting that the total number forcibly returned was at least in the hundreds. Reports indicate that Turkish police threatened or misled Assyrians to coerce them into signing voluntary return forms. This occurred ahead of Turkey's military incursion into northeastern Syria in October. Allegations of refoulement, that is forced return to a country or territory where persecution is likely, of Syrians were officially denied by authorities, who insisted that a total of 315,000 Syrians had returned voluntarily. Migrants and asylum seekers faced arbitrary detention and risked refoulement at Turkey's airports, where they did not have effective access to asylum procedures or assistance. In January, a man was detained arbitrarily in an Istanbul airport and forcibly deported to Egypt, where he was held in incommunicado detention and risked execution. In May, a Palestinian asylum seeker from Syria was arbitrarily held for weeks in the new Istanbul airport, and attempts were made to deport him to Lebanon, with the risk of chain refoulement to Syria. 5. 1. Amnesty International, Turkey. Judicial reform package has a lost opportunity to address deep flaws in the judicial system. Index E44/1161/2019 www.amnesty.org web link. 2. Amnesty International, Turkey. We can't complain. Turkey's continuing crackdown on dissent over its military Operation Peace Spring in northeast Syria. Index E44/1335/2019 www.amnesty.org web link. 3. Amnesty International, Turkey. Hunger strikes. Rights violations faced by prisoners on hunger strikes and those protesting in solidarity. Index E44/0835/2019 www.amnesty.org web link. 4. Amnesty International, Turkey. Sent to a war zone. Turkey's illegal deportations of Syrian refugees. Index E44/1102/2019 www.amnesty.org web link. E44/1102/2019 5. Amnesty International, Turkey. Palestinian held in airport risks deportation. Mohammed Ajlanians. Index E44/0670/2019 www.amnesty.org web link. Documents E44/0670/2019 Human Rights in Europe. 83. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. United Kingdom. United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland Head of State, Queen Elizabeth II. Head of Government, Boris Johnson, replaced Theresa May in July. Counter-terrorism laws continued to restrict rights. Full accountability for torture allegations against UK intelligence agencies and armed forces remained unrealised. Northern Ireland made significant progress on abortion and same-sex marriage. Legal, constitutional or institutional developments. the second draft political declaration on the future relationship between the UK and EU, published in October 2019, included less robust assurances around membership of the European Convention on Human Rights, ECHR, than the first version. The government confirmed that it intends to derogate from the ECHR before significant future military operations were deemed appropriate. The Scottish Government built on its commitment to incorporate the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, promising to bring forward legislation to incorporate UN treaties into Scots law. Counter-Terrorism and Security. The Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Act 2019 created new criminal offences that give rise to serious human rights concerns. These included entering or remaining in a designated area overseas, expressing an opinion or belief supportive of a prescribed organisation, if reckless as to whether that encourages another person to support them, publishing images of articles or clothing in a way which suggests you are a member or supporter of a prescribed organisation, and the mere viewing of terrorist-related material on the Internet. Further, it created a new Schedule 3 inches border security power which permits suspicionless detention and searches based on the vague concept of hostile activity. A statutory review of the PREVENT programme was established. However, several NGOs objected to both the lack of impartiality of the chosen reviewer and the scope and approach of that inquiry. The reviewer was subsequently stood down. The government removed British citizenship from people who had travelled to Syria and Iraq and were allegedly associated with the armed group calling itself Islamic State, including against at least one woman who had left the UK for Syria as a child. Death penalty. In January, the High Court rejected a challenge to the Home Secretary's decision to agree to a mutual legal assistance request from the USA to transfer evidence in the case of al-Sheikh, without requiring assurances against the use of the death penalty. This was in contravention of the long-standing policy of seeking assurances to remove the possibility of the death penalty. Impunity. The UK still did not conduct a human rights compliant inquiry or introduce other accountability measures for alleged abuses perpetrated by the British Armed Forces in Iraq between 2003 and 2009. The Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, ICC, continued its preliminary examination of these war crimes claims. In July, the Ministry of Defence consulted on proposals for a presumption against prosecution of armed forces personnel for alleged offences committed in the course of duty outside the UK more than 10 years ago, as well as restricting the court's discretion to extend the time limit for bringing compensation claims for personal injury and or death in relation to historical events outside the UK. Torture and other ill treatment. In June, the UN Committee Against Torture was critical of the government's continuing failure to meet obligations in the convention. In direct contradiction of previous promises, the government announced in July that it would not establish the long-anticipated independent judge-led inquiry into allegations of complicity in torture and other ill-treatment of detainees held by other countries in counter-terrorism operations overseas since 2001. A review of the revised Consolidated Principles Governing Torture, Other ill-treatment and broader detainee issues did not result in significant policy improvements sought by NGOs. The renamed and rewritten principles continued to leave room for ministerial discretion to authorize activities where a real risk of torture existed. A Freedom of Information request subsequently uncovered a separate, secret, Ministry of Defence policy permitting intelligence sharing where there is a serious risk of torture if ministers agree that the potential benefits justify accepting the risk and the legal consequences that may follow. In September, the Court of Appeal in Northern Ireland dismissed an appeal by the Police Service of Northern Ireland, PSNI, of a ruling against a police decision to end its investigation into the torture of the 14 hooded men who were abused while in detention by the British Army and the Royal Ulster Constabulary in 1971. In November, the Court of Appeal further dismissed the PSNI's application for leave to appeal this decision to the UK Supreme Court. The PSNI retained the right to apply directly to the Supreme Court. Northern Ireland legacy issues. The government released funds to address a backlog of more than 90 conflict-related coroner's inquests, although the 2014 Stormont House. Human Rights in Europe. 84. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. Agreement was still not implemented and more than 1,000 killings from the decades-long conflict were still waiting for new investigation processes. In February, the UK Supreme Court found that the official investigation into the 1989 killing of Belfast solicitor Patrick Finucane was ineffective and failed to meet human rights standards. In September, his family announced they would continue to appeal for an independent public inquiry. In November, legislation was passed to provide redress for thousands of children who had suffered abuse in residential institutions in Northern Ireland during the period 1922 to 1995. Sexual and reproductive rights. On the 3rd of October, Sarah Ewart and Amnesty International won their legal challenge at Belfast High Court, which found that Northern Ireland's abortion law was incompatible with the UK's human rights obligations under the ECHR. That month, legislation came into force decriminalising abortion in Northern Ireland and all pending criminal proceedings were dropped. Regulations to enable access to abortion, including in cases of risk to the woman's health, serious or fatal fetal anomalies, and pregnancy resulting from gender-based violence was due by end of March 2020. In the interim, the government will fund travel and healthcare costs for women from Northern Ireland to travel to England. Discrimination. A government compensation scheme became available in April for people who had been affected by the so-called Windrush scandal. However, the full extent of the injustice had not been acknowledged by the government, and the racism that underpinned the laws and policies at the heart of this scandal had not been addressed. In many cases, people who had settled in the UK prior to 1973 and their dependents had been treated as if they had no permission to be in or return to the UK despite their being entitled to stay indefinitely after entering the country as British nationals. In October, new legislation came into effect which will legalise same-sex civil marriage in Northern Ireland from January 2020. The government had yet to respond to a consultation on reforming the Gender Recognition Act in England and Wales, which concluded in October 2018. Women's rights. The Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women's CEDAW, concluding observations on the UK's 8th periodic report highlighted inconsistent implementation of CEDAW's provisions across the country due to devolved administration. The periodic review process shed light on the disproportionate impact of austerity policies on women, in particular women from ethnic minority backgrounds and women with disabilities. In July 2019, a domestic abuse bill was introduced to Parliament without provisions to ensure safety and access to justice for migrant women, despite recommendations from parliamentary committees. Women's rights organisations and press exposed a crisis of justice for victims of rape in England and Wales. Crown Prosecution Service figures show a marked decrease in prosecutions against an increase in reports. Civil society organisations exposed a practice whereby the police asked victims of sexual assault to hand over their phones, suggesting that open-ended consent to access their data was required in order for investigations to move forward, even where perpetrators are strangers or the abuse historic. This practice is under investigation by the Information Commissioner's Office. Right to life. In October, the public inquiry into London's Grenfell Tower fire in June 2017 published its first report. The report answered some questions about the immediate cause and actions during the fire, in which 72 people died and dozens were injured. The inquiry continued and was due to explore the decision-making regarding the building and the broader context they were taken in, as well as the support the authorities provided to the community in the aftermath of the fire. The fire raised questions concerning the authorities' and private actors' compliance with their human rights obligations and responsibilities, including protection of the right to life and guaranteeing an adequate standard of living, including the right to adequate housing, economic, social and cultural rights. In his report on the UK issued in May, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights strongly criticised the country's austerity policies, finding that they have resulted in around 14 million people living in poverty, with almost 1 in 2 children affected. Refugees and asylum seekers. Considerable uncertainty persisted concerning post-Brexit immigration policy and practice. The UK's restrictions on family reunion continued to prevent many refugee families from being together. The rules do not allow adult refugees to be joined by their children who are over 18, and the UK is one of the only countries in Europe in which unaccompanied child refugees do not have the right to be joined by even their closest relatives. There was increased concern about the post-Brexit future of arrangements whereby refugee and asylum-seeking children could be transferred to the UK from EU member states, including children with family in the UK. Meanwhile, 2019 saw a rise in the number of people attempting to reach the UK by boat, and at least 2 people were known to have drowned in the attempt. Human rights in Europe. 85. Review of 2019. Amnesty International. In November, 39 people from Vietnam were found dead in a refrigerated trailer on an industrial estate in Essex. The government responded by calling for more focus on tackling human traffickers and other criminals. However, it failed to address warnings about the lack of safe and legal migration channels, or the role of immigration policy, practice and rhetoric in driving people to undertake dangerous journeys. Corporate accountability. In June, the High Court declared that a Prisons and Probation Ombudsman investigation into serious mistreatment and abuse of detainees at Brook House Immigration Removal Centre by officers of the private security firm G4S was inadequate for lack of power to compel witnesses. The judgment said that unless the terms of reference were extended to include that power, it would not comply with UK government's investigative duties under Article 3 of the ECHR, the right not to be subjected to inhuman and degrading treatment. The Home Secretary announced in November that the investigation would instead take the form of a statutory inquiry. ARMS trade. In a judicial review brought by the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, CART, and joined by Amnesty, Human Rights Watch and Rights Watch UK, the Court of Appeal ruled that the UK government's decision to continue licensing exports of military equipment to Saudi Arabia was unlawful. The case will be heard by the Supreme Court in early 2020, and Amnesty, Human Rights Watch and Rights Watch have applied to intervene. Freedom of assembly. In February, anti-deportation activists known as the Stansted 15 Inches were convicted under the Aviation and Maritime Security Act 1990, a terrorism-related law, and given non-custodial sentences for chaining themselves around an immigration removal flight at Stansted Airport. In August, The Court of Appeal granted them leave to appeal against their convictions. However, concerns remained about the use of terrorism-related laws to prosecute activists engaged in non-violent direct action. In October, the Metropolitan Police issued a Section 14 order under the Public Order Act imposing a blanket ban in London on protests by Extinction Rebellion. In November, the High Court ruled that the ban had been unlawful. Freedom of expression. Julian Assange was arrested in April 2019 in the premises of the Embassy of Ecuador after the Ecuadorian government arbitrarily withdrew his nationality. He was sentenced to 50 weeks for skipping bail. The US submitted an extradition request on the grounds of 17 charges under the Espionage Act and 1 charge under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. In the US, he would face real risks of serious human rights violations. The charges relate to the release of disclosed documents and his publishing activities with Wikipedia. At the end of the year, the extradition procedure was pending. Human Rights in Europe Review of 2019. Amnesty International. Human Rights in Europe Review of 2019. This report documents the state of human rights in Europe during 2019. It is composed of a regional overview and 35 country entries, subdivided by key human rights themes. In the heart of Europe, some states actively sought to erode the independence of the judiciary to avoid state accountability. The European Union continued to outsource border and migration control. Grave human rights risks ensued. Tens of thousands of people remained exposed to conflict, violence, torture, and an uncertain future in destitute conditions. Those opposing these border and migration control policies frequently faced smear campaigns, harassment, and even administrative and criminal penalties. Increasing numbers of human rights defenders, activists, and independent media faced intimidation and prosecution. Expressions of dissent on the streets were often met with a range of restrictive measures and excessive use of force by police. Against this overall backdrop of intolerance and discrimination, minorities and those seeking to defend their rights were met with violence, increasing stigmatization of some communities. Survivors of sexual violence, including rape, continued to face obstacles in accessing justice. While 2 countries held their first ever Pride parades, there was a rollback in a number of others on law and policies related to the rights of LGBT people. Index Euro 1/2098/2020 Original language English. Amnesty.org